Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Myers, and I'm delighted to be talking with Richard Waugaman today, the psychoanalyst and an author of many papers on Shakespeare and Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and on other good subjects. Richard joins us today with, I guess, his favorite author in the background. And what does it say on the button on your shirt, on your jacket?
Oh, thanks for asking. I'm glad you noticed. Many people don't even notice, but it's Shakespeare is an Avon product.
I assume we're not talking about the cosmetics maker.
Well, it links with that implicitly, that it's kind of a commercial thing when you think about it. So I like the fact that it's said in so few words. I think brevity is the soul of wit. And so there's a lot in that lapel button.
Where'd you get it?
Markley Roberts, and thanks for asking that. Markley Roberts, when he was moving from his home of many years to a smaller retirement condo, was generous in giving me lots of things he no longer had room for, including this lapel button.
Excellent. All right. And Markley's a really good guy, an Oxfordian. I want to talk about your latest paper. I'm going to read the title: "The Origins of Modern Literary Theory and the Repudiation of Autobiographical Readings of Shakespeare's Sonnets." It was requested, I think, by the editors of a book in your field. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, let me just clarify to start with that I did revise the title, and the working title that will appear in the book is "What Shakespeare Teaches Us About Psychological Complexity." So yes, you're right. The book is edited by two mainstream Shakespeare scholars, one at American University in the Washington, D.C. area, one at Case Western Reserve. And I had learned of their interest in psychoanalytic approaches to Shakespeare several years ago. A meeting of the Shakespeare Association of America that I didn't actually attend, but I saw they were giving a workshop on psychoanalytic approaches. So I wrote to them and just introduced myself to them. And then maybe 2-3 years ago, they offered that workshop again. And I tried to register for it, but it was full. But they were very interested to know that I was interested in their topic, not as an English professor, not as an official Shakespeare scholar, but as a clinical psychoanalyst. And I think they were so interested in that it overcame whatever reservations they may have had about learning I'm a so-called authorship heretic. And so that kind of played out over my interactions with them writing this chapter.
Has this book come out yet, or we have something?
No, it's due to be published in July. And in fact, I got curious. These things can be really, really slow. So a month or so ago, I looked at the Routledge website and checked forthcoming titles and saw it there. And I shared that with the other contributors, and the editor said they hadn't known it was on the website, so they were grateful to see that.
Editors are often the last to know. So let's get into it. Because I have inside information. Tell us about references to Oxford, the Earl of Oxford, 17th Earl of Oxford, in your paper that both survive and didn't survive. And
thanks for asking. Go ahead.
And that might just lead us into some of the difficulties in focusing on authorship per se.
Yes, thanks for asking about that, Bob. To me, that was one of the more interesting aspects of this whole experience. So I do want to re-emphasize my deep gratitude to the two editors for inviting me to contribute a chapter. So I was the only person who was not physically at the seminar they gave at the Shakespeare Association of America who was invited to write a chapter for the book. And I didn't know. And I have to admit, until the book is published, I'm still not entirely certain whether this will come about or not. But so the experience was very, very positive in getting to contribute to that book. And not surprisingly, there was pushback when I tried to include material about Oxford in my chapter.
Now, the pushback came from the editors or from other people pushing them?
That I don't know. That's intriguing to think about. So let me just tell you some of the experiences, just trying to read between the lines, although they never said this came from the publisher, that is the editor at Routledge. They were very strict with all the contributors about some formatting issues. For example, they said if we quoted anyone in our chapters, we had to have permission from that publisher to use that quotation. Now, I have over 100 publications on Shakespeare now and 100 publications on other psychoanalytic topics. I've never run into that before. I had one article for a psychiatric journal in which I was quoting Emily Dickinson. And to my surprise, the editor of that journal said I could not quote her entire poem because Harvard owned the copyright to Emily Dickinson's poetry and they wouldn't allow copying an entire poem. So I had to quote just a few lines. Well, that's the only thing at all comparable. So we were exchanging emails with the two editors of our book and the other contributors. And when we got that information, people kind of freaked out. And I said, gee, the adage I've always followed is apologize afterwards, don't ask for permission beforehand. So nevertheless, although that didn't create a problem, when I quoted an email that the Shakespeare scholar Stephen Greenblatt had sent me, the two editors, I'll refer to the two editors, not the editor at Routledge, the two editors I was dealing with said they could not include that email unless I had Stephen Greenblatt's permission. So I asked him, and he quickly said that was fine with him. So to answer your question, I don't know if it was entirely them, if they got pushback from Routledge, if they were kind of looking over their shoulder. And that's intriguing to think about.
Yeah.
I think people who deal with us authorship skeptics who are themselves in the mainstream often are concerned about how that may affect their reputation.
All right, let me just ask one more question on this, then I want to go into the heart of the paper.
Yeah.
Is it possible that this thing could get killed between now and July?
I believe so.
Okay, well, let's hope it isn't.
Well, Bob, you may know this did happen to me with a previous publication. The journal was called Memoria di Shakespeare. It's an Italian journal published in English on Shakespeare. And the two editors invited me to update a paper I'd already published on the psychology of Stratfordian biographies of Shakespeare. And they sent me one of their issues. I remember it cost them over 10 euros to mail me the previous issue. Wow. I say that only because there's been dispute about whether they really had committed to publishing my paper or not. And several months after things were being finalized, I heard from a new editor, Gary Taylor, that he had taken over the journal on condition that my article be deleted. So that can happen.
He's a professor somewhere in Florida, right?
Yeah, I think at Florida State, yeah.
I wonder what their bracket is like this year. Okay, so I've read your paper, and I want you to start. If I understand your paper accurately, there can be an interpretation of the sonnets and a number of plays that state or infer that the author is bisexual or homosexual.
Yes.
And that in contrast to the traditional approach to reading Shakespeare, traditional last 150 years, which says, forget the author, just focus on the text, that if you take that particular approach, it shatters the idea of Shakespeare as an untutored genius who happened to walk past the right bushes and bars and overheard stuff on the whatever the Elizabethan equivalent of the tram was, incorporated it into his plays, and there you are. We don't need nothing else to see here. Move along.
True.
Thank you. And I should have been as brief as you. So start talking about.
Oh, sure. No, I have much more to say than that one word. That was just an introduction. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Bob. I think this is really, really crucial for anybody who has a serious interest in Shakespeare to learn how the mainstream scholarly consensus about how to read Shakespeare is flawed, deeply, deeply flawed. I just recently read something from, I think it was the 18th century, that was taking Shakespeare to task for violating the laws of drama. And that's a pretty serious offense. I think it's not just a misdemeanor to violate the laws. So believe it or not, good old Aristotle ruled not only in ancient times, but not only through the Middle Ages, but was still ruling in early modern England and subsequently. So Aristotle described the so-called unities of time and place, that a good play had to take less than 24 hours and be in one location and so on. Now, as I understand it, his favorite play was Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos. And he then extrapolated from that one play these observations, generalizations, which over the centuries became kind of petrified into laws. So I'm mentioning this because these 18th century Shakespeare critics recognized his brilliance, but said the only conceivable reason he violated the laws of drama was that he was ignorant of them. So this, I was very excited to come across this. I had not known that was an important origin of the myth that Shakespeare was just a genius, an unschooled genius, a child of nature. And so he could, I guess, use that as a legal defense for violating these laws, that he was unaware of the laws. And the good lawyer, he might have gotten off with a light sentence. So I'm being a little bit facetious here, but so that's an important part of the story that I only recently became aware of.
Talk, if you would, about the sonnets. The sonnets, we are in the quatricennial anniversary year of the first folio.
Yes.
And it has 36 plays, 18 of which had never been seen before.
Nope, never published.
And the 154 sonnets and the long poems were also, Venus and Adonis, the Rape of Lucrece, were also not in that book. So there has to be a question why, since when you read the introductions keep saying, buy this book. So how come this, and those long poems were enormous successes when they were printed? Why do you think they were left out of the first folio?
Well, Bob, for our listeners, I first want to say that I believe there's an unwritten law among Shakespeare scholars. You're not allowed to ask that question. They don't ask it. They just skip over it. They don't want us to think about that. They don't want us to think for ourselves, basically. They don't want us to have the kind of critical thinking skills that might lead us to be critical of them.
I've always been a screw up in that regard. So,
I can relate to that. So basically, that is an extremely important observation. They might claim that this was unprecedented to have a folio, a very lavish, expensive collection of Elizabethan plays. And yet, that's not true, because 7 years earlier, 7 years before 1623 and 1616, Ben Jonson published a folio collection in one volume of his collected plays and poetry.
Ben
So
Jonson's plays and poetry, not anybody else.
Right, just Ben Jonson. He was very prolific. So to the extent there was precedent, the precedent was for including the author's poetry, not just plays. So that is interesting. And it leads to the suspicion something was going on, something was being suppressed. And there's a book by the publisher Robert Giroux on the history of the first edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, published in 1609. And he believes that there was an effort to suppress that after it was published, that only, I think, 13 first editions survive. I don't know. I don't know if he's correct about that, but it's certainly interesting that they weren't included in the 1623 folio. You would expect that they would be. The long poems were so popular, they went through many, many early editions. We have to conclude the sonnets were popular too. But getting to the issue of bisexuality, the copy of the sonnets, first edition, that's at the Folio Shakespeare Library, has a handwritten annotation at the end referring to what awful infidel stuff is in these poems. Infidel, open to interpretation, but it certainly suggests that an early reader who hopefully was annotating his own copy of it was offended by the sonnets. And so one possible inference is that to me, blatant bisexuality offended people. Now, some people will say, in fact, most Shakespeare scholars until the last 10 years said, oh, no, you're misreading them. These sonnets weren't about Shakespeare's feelings for the fair youth. Maybe they were written on commission. Maybe he was imagining what it would be like to be gay or bisexual. Oh, there was precedent. There was precedent for poems like this. Well, Sidney Lee, who was a very, very important figure in this whole story, looked diligently for precedent of bisexual sonnets. And mostly what he found was in the French literature, the Italian literature. There was much, much less available in English poetry. And in the Italian literature, by the way, I just think of Michelangelo's sonnets, most of which were to a young man he was infatuated with. But when they were published by his great nephew, the pronouns were changed to conceal the homosexual nature of the love poems. And it was, I think, another century before the actual wording was published as Michelangelo wrote it. So, as I said, this is all, to me, a really, really important part of the story.
Let me, if I may, let me go to the plays, the 18 plays that were new in the portfolio. Is there any commonality of theme or language or thought to those 18 plays compared to the other plays that were widely known?
Well, Bob, that's a question I hope other Oxfordian scholars will pursue. That question has occurred to me. I haven't looked into it in any systematic way. I would just presume that there were good reasons that they had not been published before 1623, that there was too much no longer veiled, too transparent commentary on court politics. That is, I think, a plausible hypothesis for why none of these plays were originally published under Oxford's name, and that in 1623, for the first time, there was a concerted effort to make it look as though the Merchant of Stratford, Shakespeare of Stratford, was the author. Bob, I think of the lack of poems memorializing Shakespeare at the time of his death, that is the Merchant in 1616, Did you hear the news about the William Bass poem about the death of? So this just came to my attention very recently. So the Stratfordians would say, oh, yes, there were loads of poems. For example, William Bass wrote a poem on the death of Shakespeare. Well, it's very, very flimsy evidence. It's not clear when it was published for the first time. No evidence that it was written soon after the death of Shakespeare in 1616. But it turns out William Bass had connections with Oxford's daughter and son-in-law. And may indeed have been, and he knew Ben Jonson well, he may indeed have been asked to write this poem leading up to the publication of the first folio as part of the effort of Ben Jonson and others, and presumably Oxford's daughter Susan and son-in-law and the son-in-law's brother, the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, who were the dedicatees of the first folio, to concoct this cover story to keep the family name safe from all the repercussions if it were known that these were the plays of the Earl of Oxford. So that's kind of a tangent, but I'm just very excited.
It's an interesting tangent. I think often of John Stubbs and his right hand. He wrote a pamphlet. I have a lot of sympathy for people who write pamphlets on in effect, 16th century version of freelance writers, but they didn't. He wrote a pamphlet with a pen held in his right hand, and in it he said the Queen was too old to marry, and anyone, Spanish or any other nationality. The Queen did not take fondly to that remark.
That's an understatement.
And since he was right-handed, she ordered that his right hand be cut off, which it was. And there's a popularly available woodcut of that you can find on Google Images. And that's what happens to people who anger the Queen. Now, I'm wondering if, with that as an example, if there are ways of looking at some of the plays that get into court life. And I know in your paper, you talk about the Tempest, Love's Labour's Lost, the character of Falstaff, and they all have some connection to the court. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, yeah. Thanks for telling that story. That's an important one. It might have needed a trigger warning because it is shocking to many people who have an idealized misconception of what that era was like. And I think idealization is helpful up to a point, but if we're trying to be objective, we need to see the truth. And one Shakespeare scholar credited Delia Bacon in the 1800s with giving the first accurate depiction of how ruthless the Elizabethan age could be, exactly the kind of story that you shared. So let me give an example of what I think is a really transparent allusion to court politics. And it's not from the plays you mentioned. They have plenty of examples themselves, but many people consider Hamlet to be Shakespeare's best play. And we Oxfordians consider it to be one of his most autobiographical plays. So you might ask a mainstream Shakespeare scholar, well, do you remember in the first quarto of Hamlet, the one that was first published, we don't have Polonius in there. And instead, we have this character named Corambus, Corambis. What about that? Well, they had an answer. Starting in the 1800s and up until 1950, you can find respected Shakespeare scholars who said, oh, well, because Polonius is a spoof of Lord Burleigh, the Corambus name had to be changed because it was a satire on the motto of Lord Burleigh, cor unum via una, one heart, one way. Corambus implies two hearts, both hearts, or duplicitous, the same etymology of our word duplicity, duplicitous. Okay. And so, of course, that had to be changed. Well, interestingly enough, Lord Burleigh was the father-in-law of Oxford. Not only that, he helped raise Oxford after Oxford's father died when he was 12, so he was Oxford's guardian. So then you look at the love interest of Hamlet, Ophelia, and it turns out she has a lot in common with Lord Burleigh's daughter, Anne, whom he had Oxford marry. But Burleigh was known for maintaining a large spy network of his own, in addition to Walsingham's spy network in Elizabethan England. And Hamlet turns on Ophelia when he has reason to believe that she is being used as a tool of her father to spy on him. So anyway, all of this is very, very relevant to what courtiers may have perceived when they watched Hamlet at court, that Oxford was making fun of his father-in-law, despite how powerful Lord Burleigh was, and that the son of Polonius Laertes then would have possibly been Robert Cecil or Robert Cecil's brother. And Robert Cecil gets spoofed himself as Richard III, who did not have a hunchback in historical reality, but Robert Cecil did have a pronounced hunchback. Queen Elizabeth gave him a nickname of My Pygmy, which may have rankled Robert Cecil, constantly being teased for being a hunchback.
There's a new movie out called The Lost King, and The Lost King tells the true story of a lady in a group in England who sought to find Richard III's bones and burial grounds.
Yeah.
And she did, in, I believe, the town of Leicester. And she was, other people who thought she was wacky stole credit from her.
Oh, yeah, story.
Yeah, it really is.
Men will steal credit.
And she was later given, I think it's the OBE award, or the Order of the British Empire, for her work. But she also used DNA analysis. Because it was a way of tracing a descendant of Richard III to a contemporary in England. Now, that's quite something. But the analysis said that those bones could be genealogically connected to somebody alive. There are a lot of lessons there for Oxfordians and for and doubters. So I would urge you and anyone else to see it. We saw it this weekend in a theater. I think it's actually online. The Lost King. Really interesting. All right. I want to know about Falstaff.
Oh, Falstaff, yeah. Well, he's one of my favorite characters and one of everybody's favorite characters, and allegedly one of Queen Elizabeth's favorite characters.
Why do you think that was, Doctor?
Yeah, I think for the rest of us, he's just a brilliantly conceived character who is much, much more than a comical character. He has enormous depth. We can enjoy Falstaff on many levels. It's been observed that in the plays he's in, he quotes the Bible more than any other character. He sometimes speaks in Latin, so he's well educated. He's not simply a buffoon. And the loyalty that some people have to him suggests that he has fallen considerably from the kind of person he had been in the past. So when Orson Welles' classic film Chimes at Midnight was re-released after decades of legal problems with the copyright, kept it from being re-released. My wife and I saw it several times, and I was so taken with this notion that Falstaff has numerous similarities with King Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth's mother. And so I worked on that, and with the kind editorial help of Gary Goldstein, I dug and dug and dug, primarily in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, to look for further parallels between the two, and there are tons of further parallels. So here's my psychoanalytic, so to say, formulation. that Oxford wrote for many reasons. One of the reasons was to please Queen Elizabeth, who was giving him significant financial support starting in 1589, £1,000 a year, a lot of money.
Might be $500,000 in
Yeah,
standard.
right, right, big bucks. And that one way to please Queen Elizabeth was to help her reconcile some of her core psychological conflicts, and that one of them was probably a core conflict between love of her father, Henry VIII, gratitude to him for allowing her to be the monarch in her own time, but also bitter resentment that he had her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed. So I kind of looked at that formulation and decided that she could see different aspects of her father embodied in this character, Henry VIII. And speaking of body, one Shakespeare scholar said there are more physical descriptions of Falstaff than any character in all of Shakespeare's plays. And his corpulence is a recurrent theme. So I was shocked to find out her father, King Henry VIII, was roughly 6'2", 6'3", weighed maybe 200 pounds when he was younger, and they still have his final suit of armor, and they estimate he had gained a lot of weight, up to about 380, 390 pounds by the time of his death, at a time when morbid obesity was not common the way it is now.
Right.
And there's even a word in the play that connects with Henry VIII's disability late in life, that they had to have a system of levers to help him get up on a horse and so on upstairs. And when they're trying to get Falstaff to get down on the ground for the Gad's Hill robbery, the whole thing, of course, is a prank on Falstaff. They tell him you have to hide down on the ground. He said, "Yes, but once being down, who will lever me up?" I believe that's the only use of the word lever in Shakespeare.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh,
So those are some of the things that led me to make that formulation.
Tell me about the Tempest, which is a play that, like a lot of other Shakespeare plays, has reconciliation as a theme running through it. And one could say, or raise the question, as people smarter than me have done, it was Shakespeare's last play. He begins by saying, "I'm going to throw my magic down,"
Yes.
because perhaps he's ill, perhaps he is tired and depressed. But talk a bit, if you would, about the Tempest in terms of your study.
Well, it is my favorite Shakespeare play, and I think it is one of the favorite plays for many people.
Why is it one of your favorite plays?
Perhaps because it captures some of the quintessential aspects of Shakespeare's works that most appeal to me, and that I found it my favorite play even before my authorship opinion shifted to the Oxfordian authorship theory. So, for example, I saw, I believe, a film version of it in my psychiatric training, and wrote a paper that was chosen for presentation at the annual meeting of the hospital where I trained. I later kept working on that paper. And then, after becoming an Oxfordian, I gave a presentation on that play that was later published, seeing lots and lots of layers of meaning I'd overlooked before.
Give me a couple of layers. I want to start archaeologically digging down into the layers.
So I thought of Prospero as standing for the playwright, and that's not unusual. Many people, including Henry James, have taken that view. Henry James wrote a fantastic essay on the Tempest. It was a series of prefaces to Shakespeare plays. So the idea that this is personal on various levels, the Earl of Oxford, as Henry James said, comes farther forward to meet us than he does in any of his other plays, that he always holds back his own identity and so carefully, but we see more of him here. So, for example, I was fascinated to learn that even though Ovid's Metamorphoses is alluded to in many, many Shakespeare plays, this is the only play where it's quoted verbatim in one of Prospero's speeches, Ye Elves of Hills, and so on. And the specific translation that's being quoted is that ostensibly by Oxford's uncle, Arthur Golding. But I've done a lot of research on that translation and wrote an article offering several lines of evidence that it was the adolescent Oxford who wrote that translation that was published starting in 1565 when he was just 15 years old. And I believe that in a way, if this was Oxford's final play, which I think probably it was, he is going all the way back to one of his first major literary works, which was published under another name, an allonym. That is, Arthur Golding's name was put on it, but I believe that was because Oxford was a noble and nobles didn't publish under their own name in their lifetime literary works. That is, so I find that very, very intriguing and exciting to think that he's kind of summing up his literary life with that allusion. And the epilogue, the farewell from the stage to the audience, just comes across as utterly genuine with his fears of what will happen in his afterlife. That he's
quite poignant.
Yeah,
very, very poignant.
Yes, yes.
You know, I mean, it's particularly poignant if you are, as I am, both a skeptic and an Oxfordian.
Yes.
If you're simply a straightforward Shakespearean, it's still poignant, but you miss those layers.
Absolutely.
Love's Labour's Lost has a lot of French in it. What do we know about that?
Well, here, Bob, I have to defer to my wife, Elizabeth, who has published on that play. Her PhD is in medieval French literature, and she had a lot of courses, not only on Middle Ages, but the Renaissance, French, Italian, English literature and history. So she's dug deeply into that one, and she's convinced me that the author of that play knew far more about inside court politics in France from the 1560s, 1570s, that the businessman from Stratford was likely to know.
Well, I can explain that. It's because all the people who attended the plays, the groundlings, who were otherwise illiterate, somehow knew French, and they could understand the words French. You see, if you take the right attitude, you can solve anything. Pass that along to your wife. Pass that along to your wife.
I'm going to share that with her.
Lastly, I want to ask you about Sigmund Freud and his, I don't want to say change of heart, but as I read in your paper, Freud twice read J.T. Looney's book, Shakespeare Identified.
Yes, he did.
Published in 1920. And he read it in 21 or 22, something like that. And he expressed to many people that he was convinced by Looney. And you write in your paper that half of Freud's books regarding English literature were on Shakespeare. So he was a big Shakespearean, and then he learned about Oxford. But in some of his later works, you write, he was persuaded by Strachey. Was it Lytton Strachey?
James Strachey.
James Strachey, sorry. To modify what he said about Oxford. You say that Strachey was an employee of his, but also had been a patient.
Had been his patient, that's right. So it was a kind of a complicated relationship.
Yeah, so I mean, that's my question. I mean, this is Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, listening to a patient and changing something.
Yes.
How do we account for that?
Yeah, good question. I'll speculate. I believe the analysis was probably relatively brief, as it often was back then. And this is later on, after Strachey was no longer his patient, that Strachey undertook the monumental task of translating Freud's complete psychological works into English. So that was, I think, 24 volumes of writings, and then a 25th volume that was just the index. So we have the correspondence between Freud and Strachey on this matter. And Freud's reply to Strachey was really noteworthy. He said, well, you say that this will damage my standing in England if it's known that I question the traditional Shakespeare authorship theory. So I'll defer to you. You're an Englishman, you know better than I do how this will affect my reputation in England. But I don't really understand why it is that the English, according to you, have such an investment in Shakespeare of Stratford. After all, the Earl of Oxford was every bit as much an Englishman as the man from Stratford. Of course, Freud may have been a little bit naive about the importance of the class system in England. That was a far more complicated and emotionally important system in England than it probably was in Vienna. And maybe Freud, being Jewish as an outsider, had complex feelings about who was an insider, who was an outsider. So he left that up to Strachey. And Shakespeare scholars, many of whom have a deep respect for Freud, and many of whom have made explicit use of Freud's theories about the unconscious in their analysis of Shakespeare's works, have been really, really uneasy with Freud's support for the Oxfordian authorship theory. And they've done some things that border on dishonesty in claiming that, oh, he just held this idea briefly and gave it up. It was an aberration. It was a neurosis. Even his follower, Ernest Jones, who wrote his first 3-volume biography, considered it a neurotic aberration of Freud to believe this. But luckily, there was an analyst, a late analyst from California, who saw an article I published in a psychoanalytic newsletter where I wrote about the Tempest and said that it was by the Earl of Oxford. So he wrote to the editor who had invited me to write that piece on the Tempest and said, feel free to pass this on to Richard Waugaman, but I don't understand how can he think Oxford wrote this? He said, my work in the psychology of creativity has depended heavily on the thesis that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet after the death of his own son, Hamlet. And I don't see how we can reconcile this with this new authorship theory. But by the way, I happen to be the owner of an unpublished letter from Oxford to a from Freud to a British Oxfordian, in which Freud said that he definitely believes King Lear and all of Shakespeare's plays were written by the Earl of Oxford. So I corresponded with him. He sent me a copy of the English translation of that letter. He was ill and was hoping to sell me that letter. It has since been sold. So I was more interested in the content than owning the original letter. So I got that published in the Scandinavian Psychoanalytic Review over the intense objections of a peer reviewer who tried everything he could think of to stop its publication, including accusing me of having forged the letter. We went back. He had also opposed a previous article Roger Strittmatter and I had published in that journal. So I got just to show it can be an uphill struggle for anybody who wants to publish, but especially if you're an Oxfordian. So anyway, in that letter, I got it published and wrote a lot of commentary because I thought it was really important for everybody, including Shakespeare scholars, to know. The only reason Shakespeare had sounded tentative before was this pushback he got from his translator, James Strachey.
The only reason Freud had sounded.
Sorry, I got my names confused. Yeah, Freud. Yeah. And so here we have, a pretty convincing record that he was unambivalent. I think Freud characteristically edited what he said with the audience in view. So he once gave a talk to the Viennese ophthalmologist and used a lot of visual imagery talking with ophthalmologists. So I think talking to people in general, analysts, other readers, he knew that the Oxfordian theory was controversial, so he downplayed it somewhat. But writing to an Oxfordian, he felt free to express his unequivocal support for the Oxfordian theory.
Look, thank you for all this time. I've really enjoyed reading the paper, and I would like to know what happens.
Okay, I would like to know too.
Yeah, can't do anything about it, but keep me in mind.
Okay, thanks so much for this conversation, Bob. Really
Thanks a lot, Rick. Take care.